Arrival at St. Mary's. Angela Parker, a young, passionate nurse, walked confidently through the grand entrance of St. Mary's General Hospital, her heart swelling with the pride and determination her mother had instilled in her since she was a child. Her brown eyes sparkled with excitement, yet beneath her calm exterior lay a hint of apprehension. She had heard whispers about St. Mary's, an esteemed institution in a polished neighborhood where both staff and patients wore prestige as comfortably as their white coats. But Angela wasn't here for prestige. She was here to help people and make a difference. As she took in the gleaming floors and spotless walls under the fluorescent lights, she noticed an undercurrent of tension lingering in the air. With each step, she felt a tightening knot in her stomach, and as she reached the nurse's station, her arrival was met with curious and assessing glances. Conversations dwindled to whispers, and the once busy nurse's station grew uncomfortably quiet. Angela took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and introduced herself in a polite yet firm tone. "Good morning. I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you please direct me to the head nurse's office?" A tall blonde nurse with piercing blue eyes looked up, her expression carefully neutral as she offered a polite but distant smile. "Down the hall, third door on the right," she replied, her tone formal. Angela nodded and continued down the hall, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. She had hoped that the unease was simply part of first-day nerves, but something told her it was more than that. As she approached the door to the head nurse's office, it opened abruptly, revealing a man with sharp gray eyes and a head of meticulously styled salt and pepper hair. His white coat was immaculate, his bearing authoritative. This, she assumed, was a senior doctor. "Good morning, doctor," she said, extending a hand with a warm smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse." The doctor's gaze flicked over her with an appraising coldness. "Dr. William Greaves," he replied curtly, ignoring her outstretched hand. "I trust you're prepared to meet our high standards here at St. Mary's." Without waiting for her response, he swept past her, leaving Angela standing there, her hand falling slowly back to her side. The interaction was brief, but it left a sting. She squared her shoulders, reminding herself of her purpose, and knocked on the head nurse's door, ready to prove herself, whatever it took. Inside the office, she met head nurse Miriam Sykes, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. Nurse Sykes wasted no time diving into the rules and protocols, barely offering Angela a moment to catch her breath. The formality was expected, but the underlying edge made her realize that she would be watched closely, perhaps more so than any of her colleagues. As Angela left the office, she couldn't help but reflect on her mother's words from years before. "You're going to have to fight twice as hard as everyone else, but you have the strength of generations behind you." Those words had carried her through nursing school and difficult nights on the job. She knew that strength would sustain her here too. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of orientations and introductions. Angela kept her head high and her professionalism flawless, even as she noticed the same uneasy energy from earlier. Glances, quiet mutters, and pointed stares. Small talk attempts with her colleagues fell flat. Her responses were polite but cold, almost as if she were invisible. By the end of her shift, Angela was drained, both physically and emotionally, but her resolve remained unbroken. She had come here to help people, and no amount of cold shoulders would deter her. On her way out, she overheard two nurses gossiping around the corner. "Did you see the new hire?" one whispered, her voice laced with disdain. "Yeah. Not sure what the management was thinking," the other replied. "St. Mary's isn't exactly the neighborhood for, well, you know." Angela's stomach clenched as she silently absorbed their words. The doubt and isolation she had managed to push down all day began to creep back up, but she refused to let it show. She straightened, reminding herself that she had dealt with prejudice before, and conquered it. She wouldn't let whispered bigotry diminish her achievements or her resolve. When she reached the bus stop, she took out her phone and dialed her mother's number. The familiar, comforting voice on the other end answered after 2 rings. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" her mother asked warmly. Angela took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was challenging, Mama," she admitted, not wanting to worry her, but needing the comfort of her mother's wisdom. Her mother's voice softened with empathy, but her words were firm. "Angela Marie Parker, you've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember, you're not just there for yourself. You're there for every young girl who dreams of being in that hospital one day. Hold your head high, and don't you dare let them see you sweat." Angela felt a tear escape, which she quickly wiped away. "Yes, Mama," she replied, feeling renewed strength in her mother's words. She ended the call, her resolve stronger than ever. She would face the challenges ahead, no matter how daunting. As she waited, a sleek black car passed by the bus stop, slowing down just enough for her to catch a glimpse of Dr. Greaves behind the wheel, his gaze meeting hers briefly before he drove off. She held her head high, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She would fight, not only for herself, but for every person who had ever been underestimated or treated as invisible. She was ready for whatever St. Mary's threw at her, even if it meant battling daily for her dignity and her dreams. Little did Angela know, her presence at St. Mary's was about to spark a transformation in the hospital's corridors, one that would challenge long-standing prejudices and usher in a new era of change. The coming weeks would test her resolve in unimaginable ways, but Angela was ready to stand tall and claim her rightful place in the halls of St. Mary's General Hospital. Testing limits. Angela arrived at St. Mary's General Hospital the next morning with renewed determination. Despite the harsh reality of her first day, her mother's words gave her the resilience to push forward, head held high. She repeated her silent mantra. She was here to care for people, no matter what barriers or biases awaited her. The morning began quietly. She went about her duties, preparing patient charts and setting up for her rounds, keeping her focus on the job. However, it wasn't long before the whispers and stares returned, like a faint but persistent hum around her. Nurses and doctors would turn away just as she caught their glances, leaving Angela to wonder if she was truly invisible or if they simply wanted her to feel that way. As she organized patient charts, she noticed Dr. Greaves approaching from down the hallway, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spotted her. He paused at the nurse's station, giving a perfunctory nod to other nurses before directing his attention toward Angela. "Nurse Parker," he began, his tone sharp and cold, "I expect you to familiarize yourself with the standard protocols here at St. Mary's as quickly as possible. We maintain the highest standards, and I trust that you will keep up." Angela met his gaze steadily, suppressing her frustration. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'm here to provide the best care for our patients, just as I know you are." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly concealed it, offering only a curt nod before walking away. Angela's response, measured and confident, had managed to unnerve him, if only for a moment. She knew that Dr. Greaves would be watching her closely, ready to call her out at the slightest mistake. The pressure was palpable, but Angela resolved to maintain her professionalism. The day pressed on, and Angela soon found herself assigned to assist with the hospital's most challenging patients. While her colleagues were given lighter cases, she was repeatedly sent to deal with complex procedures and patients notorious for their difficult behavior. It didn't take long for her to realize that this wasn't a coincidence. Her assignments were deliberate, and she was being tested. "Angela," one of the nurses, Susan, called out in a sickly sweet voice that barely masked her disdain. "Would you mind taking over for Mrs. Carter in room 204? She's a bit, let's say, challenging today." Angela nodded, feigning a smile. She knew what challenging meant. Mrs. Carter was well known among the staff for her relentless demands and abrasive attitude. Rumor had it that she'd driven several nurses to tears, and it seemed that Angela was the next one to face her wrath. When she entered the room, Angela was met with a steely-eyed glare from Mrs. Carter, who lay propped up on a mountain of pillows, her arms folded across her chest. "Who are you?" Mrs. Carter demanded, her tone sharp. Angela maintained her composure, greeting her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be assisting you today. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Carter huffed, rolling her eyes. "I don't need some new nurse who doesn't know what she's doing. Get me someone else." Angela continued with gentle professionalism, noting the slight tremor in the older woman's hands, the shallow breaths she took. "I understand, Mrs. Carter. I assure you, I'm here to make sure you're comfortable and cared for. Is there anything specific that's bothering you today?" As she worked, Angela endured a stream of complaints and demands, but she remained calm and patient, addressing each of Mrs. Carter's needs with the utmost care. By the time she finished, the woman's attitude had softened slightly, though she refused to acknowledge Angela's efforts directly. Just as Angela exited the room, she spotted Dr. Greaves watching her from down the hallway, his expression unreadable. His gaze followed her as she returned to the nurse's station, where she overheard a conversation between two nurses who hadn't noticed her standing nearby. "Did you hear? They've put Parker on Mrs. Carter's case," one nurse whispered, her tone amused. "Let's see how long she lasts." The other nurse chuckled. "Yeah, they're really putting her through the ringer. If she messes up, Graves will be all over it." Angela's chest tightened, but she took a deep breath, refusing to let their words rattle her. She had come prepared for this, prepared for the subtle but unrelenting attempts to make her feel out of place, to undermine her confidence. She would not let them win. Later that day, as Angela finished up her rounds, she was called to assist with a new patient in room 412. The name Thomas Edwards was scrawled on the chart, but aside from basic details, there was little information. Curious, she made her way to the room, wondering what kind of case she'd be handling this time. As she entered, Angela was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, both arms encased in casts from what appeared to be a severe accident. Despite his injuries, there was an air of calm authority about him, his eyes sharp and discerning. He watched her with a steady gaze as she approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Edwards," she said, offering him a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker. I'll be taking care of you during your stay." Mr. Edwards nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nurse Parker, it's a pleasure. I appreciate your help." His tone was polite, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time that day, Angela felt a sense of ease in her work. As she began her assessment, Mr. Edwards continued to observe her with a keen interest. He asked questions about her background and experience, his tone genuine and respectful. Unlike some of the other patients, he showed no hint of prejudice or disdain. Rather, he seemed to genuinely value her expertise. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," he remarked, his eyes studying her intently as she adjusted his IV. "How long have you been at St. Mary's?" Angela hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his directness. "Only a few weeks," she replied carefully. "It's been an experience." He chuckled softly, sensing the underlying weight in her words. "I can imagine. Hospitals like this often have their own unique challenges." Angela looked up, her eyes meeting his in silent acknowledgement. There was something about Mr. Edwards, something that suggested he understood more than he let on. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Greaves, who entered the room with an overly enthusiastic smile, a demeanor Angela had never seen him use with her or any other patient. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice smooth and warm, "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you. We only assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela fought to keep her expression neutral, knowing full well that Dr. Greaves had never shown such confidence in her abilities before. His words were meant to impress Mr. Edwards, but the sudden change in his demeanor didn't escape the patient's notice. "Indeed, she has," Mr. Edwards replied, his tone polite but firm. "Nurse Parker is quite capable, and I appreciate her professionalism." Dr. Greaves's smile wavered momentarily, but he quickly regained his composure. Of course, of course. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment here at St. Mary's. Angela felt a surge of anger at the blatant hypocrisy, but held her tongue, keeping her expression neutral as Dr. Greaves continued to praise the hospital's inclusive environment to Mr. Edwards. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Edwards saw through Dr. Greaves's pretense. Over the next few days, Angela spent more time with Mr. Edwards, attending to his needs and ensuring his comfort. Each time she entered the room, she felt a sense of relief, a respite from the cold and calculated scrutiny she faced elsewhere in the hospital. Mr. Edwards continued to ask her about her background, her aspirations, and her experiences at St. Mary's. His questions were thoughtful, his interest genuine, and Angela found herself opening up to him more than she had with anyone else in the hospital. Then, one afternoon, as she was changing Mr. Edwards's bandages, she overheard a hushed conversation in the hallway. "I don't care what Dr. Greaves says," a nurse's voice hissed. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice agreed. "But if we say anything, we'll just get accused of being, well, you know." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bandages, the weight of the constant suspicion bearing down on her. She felt Mr. Edwards's gaze on her and looked up to find him watching her intently, his expression one of quiet concern. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Angela forced a smile, struggling to maintain her composure. "Yes, Mr. Edwards. Just focusing on getting these bandages right." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, his eyes studying her face. "You know," he said finally, his voice thoughtful, "I've always believed that a person's character is best revealed in how they treat others, especially those who seem different from them." Angela met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She didn't know who Thomas Edwards truly was or why he had been labeled a VIP patient, but she sensed that he understood her struggle. And as she left his room that day, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he would be the ally she so desperately needed. The spark of change. Angela's days at St. Mary's grew increasingly challenging. The subtle exclusions she'd initially experienced had transformed into outright coldness and silent resentment. It seemed the harder she worked, the more she faced judgment and hostility from her colleagues, and her assignments became even more grueling. Still, she held her head high, determined to rise above the fray. Her relationship with Mr. Thomas Edwards, however, remained a rare bright spot. Each time she entered his room, Angela felt a small reprieve from the exhausting atmosphere of the hospital. He continued to ask her questions, thoughtful, meaningful questions about her journey, her challenges, and her dreams. His genuine curiosity gave her a sense of worth she seldom felt outside his room. One afternoon, as Angela was adjusting Mr. Edwards's IV drip, he looked at her with a faint smile and said, "You have a remarkable strength, Nurse Parker. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you look after each patient, no matter how they treat you." Angela paused, taken aback by his words. No one at St. Mary's had shown her even a fraction of the respect or validation he offered with his quiet presence. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. That means a lot," she replied, feeling her composure waver for the first time in weeks. Mr. Edwards nodded, his eyes holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "Strength is important, especially here. Not everyone realizes the value of people like you, Angela," he said. "But the world needs people with courage, people who don't back down." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Greaves, who entered with an uncharacteristic air of cheer. Angela had become accustomed to his mask of false warmth around Mr. Edwards. Today, however, he seemed especially eager to leave an impression. "Mr. Edwards." Dr. Greaves greeted him, flashing a smile. "I trust Nurse Parker has been looking after you well." Mr. Edwards tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "More than well. She's been exceptional," he replied, his tone measured. Dr. Greaves hesitated, clearly taken aback by the straightforward compliment. He quickly recovered, rushing past Angela to examine Mr. Edwards's chart. "Excellent to hear. We aim to provide nothing short of the best care here at St. Mary's," he replied, casting a quick glance in Angela's direction. Angela kept her gaze steady, though a knot of frustration tightened in her chest. The double standard Dr. Greaves showed toward her was glaringly obvious, yet he seemed unbothered by it. She wanted to speak up, to call out his hypocrisy, but she held her tongue, remembering her mother's words and her purpose. There was no use stooping to his level. After a few minutes, Dr. Greaves finally left the room, leaving Angela alone with Mr. Edwards once more. She sighed quietly, feeling the tension melt away as his warm gaze settled on her. "Nurse Parker, do you mind telling me more about why you chose this field?" Mr. Edwards asked, his tone gentle. Angela smiled, the memory of her journey filling her with a renewed sense of pride. "It's always been about helping people, Mr. Edwards," she said. "Growing up, I saw so many people in my community who didn't receive the care they deserved. I wanted to change that. I wanted to make a difference, no matter how small." Mr. Edwards listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "You know, there are people in high places who could learn from your dedication," he said quietly. "There's a shortage of that kind of compassion these days." Angela felt a flicker of curiosity. She hadn't thought much about Mr. Edwards's background, but his words hinted at a life lived among influential circles. Before she could ask more, the intercom buzzed, calling her to assist with another patient. As Angela left Mr. Edwards's room, she found herself pondering his words. His presence had a calming effect, but it was his quiet strength and insight that gave her a sense of hope. She sensed that he was more than he appeared, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Days passed, and the tension at St. Mary's only intensified. Angela's every move was scrutinized, her every task magnified as though her colleagues were waiting for her to fail. Despite her diligence, it seemed she was always one step away from being reprimanded or belittled. She often overheard nurses commenting on her assignments, questioning why she had been hired or speculating about how long she would last. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting shift, Angela overheard a nurse named Trish making a snide remark just out of earshot. "I don't understand why they keep her here. It's obvious she's not a fit for St. Mary's. They should just let her go." Her words stung, and for the first time, Angela felt her composure beginning to crack. She had endured weeks of silent isolation and hostility, yet the relentless judgment seemed to only grow stronger. She wondered if she would ever find acceptance in this place, or if she was destined to remain an outsider. Determined to keep her emotions in check, Angela excused herself to a quiet corner of the hospital garden, seeking solace in the fresh air. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to steady herself, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "You come from a long line of strong women. Don't ever let them see you falter." But even the strength of her ancestors felt fragile under the relentless pressure she faced at St. Mary's. As she sat on the garden bench, she was startled by a voice behind her. "Rough day." She turned to see Mr. Edwards standing nearby, his left arm still in a cast, but his face filled with quiet understanding. "Mr. Edwards," she said, quickly standing to offer him a seat, "you shouldn't be walking around so much with your injuries." He waved her concern away, chuckling softly. "Nurse Parker, I think I'm in good hands with you around." He looked at her thoughtfully, his gaze penetrating. "You know, I've seen how they treat you here. It's hard to watch." Angela hesitated, caught off guard by his openness. "It's part of the job, I suppose," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Mr. Edwards shook his head. "It shouldn't be. You deserve better than this. People like you. You're the backbone of places like St. Mary's. I've spent a long time in environments like this, and I know what real dedication looks like." He paused, his gaze softening as he continued. "I didn't plan on saying this, but you remind me of someone. My mother. She was a nurse, too. Worked in a rural hospital where people weren't always kind to her because of her background. But she never let it break her. She kept her head high and changed lives every day. Just like you. Angela felt a lump form in her throat, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Edwards. That means more than you know. Mr. Edwards nodded, placing his uninjured hand on her shoulder in a reassuring gesture. Angela, I'm not just here as a patient. I'm here because people like you need to be seen, valued, and respected. And that's going to happen soon. Before Angela could respond, he stood up and gave her a small, encouraging nod before turning back toward the hospital. His words lingered with her, filling her with an odd sense of anticipation. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift, that Mr. Edwards was more than just an ordinary patient. The following day, Angela arrived at St. Mary's to find a strange buzz in the air. Nurses and doctors whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances down the hallway. Angela caught sight of Dr. Greaves pacing near the nurses' station, his face tight with worry. As she approached, she overheard him speaking to another doctor. We can't afford a bad impression. This is a high-stakes situation. One misstep, and the reputation of St. Mary's could be at risk. Angela's curiosity piqued, but she kept her distance, sensing that whatever was happening involved Mr. Edwards. She continued with her rounds, but the tension in the air made it impossible to focus. Eventually, a nurse hurried over to her, an unusual expression of both excitement and anxiety on her face. Angela, Mr. Edwards, he's not who we thought, she whispered, her voice low but urgent. He's a major donor to the hospital's funding board. And not just that. He's the head of the board. They say he has influence over every hospital policy and executive decision. Angela's heart skipped a beat. It all made sense now. His questions, his thoughtful observations, the way he'd seemed to see right through the facade of St. Mary's. He was here not just as a patient, but as someone with the power to make real change. The whispers and the nerves from Dr. Greaves and the others weren't just about a VIP patient. They were about the very future of St. Mary's. Later, as Angela entered Mr. Edwards's room to check his vitals, he gave her a knowing smile. Surprised? He asked, a twinkle in his eye. A little, she admitted, feeling a swell of emotion. Why didn't you tell me? He shrugged lightly. Because I wanted to see the real St. Mary's. And I wanted to see if they would recognize the remarkable talent standing right in front of them. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. And that, Angela, is what makes you special. Angela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Mr. Edwards wasn't just a patient. He was an ally, a mentor, and perhaps even the catalyst for the change she had hoped for, but never dared to imagine. And as she left his room that day, she knew that the winds of change were finally blowing through the halls of St. Mary's, breaking the silence. Angela's discovery of Mr. Edwards's true identity left her feeling a mix of astonishment and cautious hope. The knowledge that he held influence over the hospital's policies and executives was empowering, but it also carried a weight. She had spent weeks enduring veiled hostility, prejudice, and outright discrimination, and while she had found solace in her work with Mr. Edwards, she still felt apprehensive. Was he truly here to make a difference, or would his influence dissolve once he left? The following morning, Angela's routine began as usual, but the tension in the air was palpable. Rumors of Mr. Edwards' status had spread quickly, and Dr. Greaves and other high-ranking staff members were unusually vigilant, attempting to project a polished image of professionalism. But despite the heightened attention, Angela noticed no improvement in her interactions with most colleagues. If anything, her fellow nurses seemed more distant and wary. The stark contrast between their behavior and the hospital's reputation for inclusivity grew more glaring each day. Later that afternoon, Angela was summoned to a meeting in the head nurse's office, where she was greeted by head nurse Sykes, who wore her usual stern expression, and Dr. Greaves, who looked uncharacteristically tense. A sinking feeling settled in Angela's stomach as she took a seat. "Nurse Parker," began Nurse Sykes, folding her hands on the desk, "we've received a few complaints regarding..." interpersonal issues. We wanted to take this opportunity to address any concerns. Angela looked from Nurse Sykes to Dr. Greaves, whose mouth was pressed into a thin line. "Complaints?" she asked, her voice calm though her mind was racing. "Could you clarify what those complaints entail?" Dr. Greaves cleared his throat, glancing at Nurse Sykes as if to gauge her reaction before responding. "It's come to our attention that some staff members feel there may be a lack of cohesion in your interactions with the team," he said carefully, his words as thinly veiled as the condescension in his gaze. Angela's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. She straightened her posture, meeting their eyes with unwavering determination. "With all due respect, I believe I have been conducting myself professionally and in accordance with Street Mary's standards. If there are any specific examples, I would be glad to address them." The room fell silent as Dr. Greaves exchanged an uncomfortable glance with Nurse Sykes. It was clear they hadn't anticipated Angela's poise or willingness to stand her ground. After a moment, Nurse Sykes leaned forward, her gaze sharper. "Nurse Parker, we expect all team members to work together harmoniously. If there are issues, it's important to adapt to the environment rather than disrupt it." Angela's eyes narrowed, though she maintained her calm demeanor. Adapt, she thought bitterly. For weeks, she had been the target of subtle hostility and discrimination, yet they were asking her to adapt to an environment designed to exclude her. Her patience, already frayed, wore dangerously thin. "I understand, Nurse Sykes," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "However, I think it's only fair to point out that a collaborative environment requires mutual respect. I've faced exclusion and scrutiny that goes beyond simple team dynamics. I'm here to care for patients, just like everyone else, and I believe respect should go both ways." Dr. Greaves's face turned a shade darker, and he opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the door swung open. To everyone's shock, Mr. Edwards stepped into the room, his expression calm yet commanding. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, his gaze sweeping over Dr. Greaves and Nurse Sykes, before settling on Angela. "I couldn't help but overhear, and I think this is a conversation I should be part of." Dr. Greaves's face paled, and Nurse Sykes stammered, "Mr. Edwards, we weren't aware you were nearby." Mr. Edwards gave a small smile, his tone courteous but firm. "I was on my way to speak with Nurse Parker about my care, but I think we have more pressing matters to discuss, don't we?" Angela could feel the shift in the room as Mr. Edwards took a seat beside her, his presence a silent but powerful show of support. Dr. Greaves and Nurse Sykes were visibly unsettled, their authority diminished in the presence of the man who held so much sway over the hospital. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards began, his voice warm and encouraging, "would you mind sharing some of the experiences you've encountered here at Street Mary's?" Angela hesitated, glancing between Mr. Edwards and the two supervisors before her. She had never expected to be put in this position, yet she realized that this was her chance, a rare opportunity to speak openly without fear of immediate reprisal. She took a steadying breath and nodded. "In my time here, I've noticed a disparity in treatment," Angela began, choosing her words carefully. "I've been subjected to excessive scrutiny, given the most challenging patient assignments, and excluded from workplace conversations. It has been difficult to feel like a valued member of the team when there's a clear lack of support and respect from some colleagues." Mr. Edwards listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He turned to Nurse Sykes and Dr. Greaves. "I must admit, I'm deeply troubled to hear this. Street Mary's has built a reputation on its inclusivity and commitment to equal treatment. Yet, from what I've observed, and from Nurse Parker's account, that reputation seems to be in jeopardy." Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Mr. Edwards, I assure you, we have always upheld the highest standards of professionalism. We simply want all staff members to feel they are contributing positively to the team." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, his gaze unyielding. "Then it sounds as if some introspection is required." If a skilled nurse like Ms. Parker feels marginalized, then perhaps it's not she who needs to adapt, but the culture of the hospital itself. The gravity of his words seemed to hang in the air, and Dr. Greaves looked as though he'd swallowed a bitter pill. Nurse Sykes fidgeted with her papers, her stern facade beginning to crumble. Perhaps a review of team dynamics and support protocols would be beneficial, Mr. Edwards continued, his tone firm but measured. I believe St. Mary's could greatly benefit from revisiting its values and ensuring they're reflected in everyday interactions. The room fell into silence, the weight of his suggestion evident. Angela felt a surge of relief mixed with vindication. She had endured so much to prove herself, and finally, someone with authority was validating her experiences. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with gratitude. "Your support means a great deal to me." Mr. Edwards nodded, giving her a reassuring smile before standing up. "I believe I'll leave you to consider our discussion," he said, casting one last look at Dr. Greaves and Nurse Sykes. "I'll be paying close attention to how things progress." As Mr. Edwards left the room, Angela saw the change in Dr. Greaves's demeanor. The same man who had belittled her on her first day now looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting away as if he could no longer bear to meet her gaze. Once the meeting ended, Angela left the office with her head held high, feeling a newfound sense of hope. The shift in power had been subtle, but it was enough to make a difference. She returned to her rounds, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The effects of Mr. Edwards's intervention began to ripple through the hospital. Over the next few days, Angela noticed subtle changes. Colleagues who had previously ignored her now acknowledged her presence with polite nods, and Dr. Greaves made a visible effort to limit his criticisms and watchful gaze. There was an unspoken tension in the air, as though the staff were waiting to see what would happen next. During a break, Angela overheard a conversation between two nurses who had often been dismissive toward her. "I heard Mr. Edwards has influence over the hospital's board," one nurse whispered. "If he's not happy with how things are run, it could mean big changes for everyone here." "Exactly. They're saying he might even bring in new policies about team dynamics and workplace conduct," the other replied, her tone laced with worry. "If that's true, we'll have to be careful how we treat everyone from now on." Angela suppressed a smile, pretending not to hear. Mr. Edwards's influence was making its mark, and the realization that her experience mattered, that someone cared enough to take action, filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Later that day, she was summoned to Mr. Edwards's room for what she thought would be a routine checkup. But when she entered, he gave her a warm smile and gestured for her to sit. "Nurse Parker, I wanted to thank you," he began, his tone sincere. "You may not realize it, but your resilience and integrity have made a powerful impact, not just on me, but on everyone in this hospital." Angela felt a surge of gratitude, humbled by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I've just been doing what I believe is right." Mr. Edwards nodded, his gaze filled with admiration. "It takes remarkable strength to do what's right, especially when faced with adversity. I'll be meeting with the board soon, and I plan to bring up several areas for improvement. Your experiences and insights have shown me just how necessary these changes are." Angela's heart swelled with gratitude. She realized that Mr. Edwards's presence at St. Mary's had not only been a gift to her, but a catalyst for change within the hospital itself. For the first time since she had joined St. Mary's, she felt that her fight for respect and equality was not in vain. As she left his room, Angela felt a newfound sense of power and purpose. She knew there was still a long way to go, but with allies like Mr. Edwards, she was no longer alone in her journey. And together, they would work to ensure that St. Mary's became a place of true healing, not just for its patients, but for everyone who walked its halls. Winds of transformation. A quiet storm of change was brewing in the pristine halls of St. Mary's General Hospital. Angela felt it in the way her colleagues hesitated before dismissing her or brushed off her ideas. She saw it in the tight-lipped looks exchanged when she walked into a room. But perhaps most telling was the subtle way the hospital administration had grown wary of Dr. Greaves, whose confident demeanor now seemed forced, a thin veneer over growing unease. Word of Mr. Edwards's influence had spread beyond the nurses' station. Staff, from nurses to doctors and administrators, were abuzz with speculation. For many, the revelation that their VIP patient held the power to influence the board's decisions was a wake-up call. And for others, those who had quietly, or not so quietly, challenged Angela's place in the hospital, it was a cause for concern. Angela knew that whatever change might come would be gradual. A system this entrenched couldn't be overhauled overnight. But she also knew that her perseverance was finally sparking discussions that could lead to tangible improvements. And even though the whispered conversations and wary glances continued, there was a shift in the way some of her colleagues treated her. Small gestures, a smile from a fellow nurse, a quick word of encouragement from a junior doctor, gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, things could truly change. A few days after the tense meeting with Nurse Sykes and Dr. Greaves, Angela was called into a conference with the hospital's board. She wasn't entirely surprised to see Mr. Edwards seated at the table, flanked by hospital administrators and a handful of board members who exuded authority with their neatly pressed suits and polished appearances. Angela's heart thumped with anticipation and a slight trepidation as she took her seat, feeling the weight of her experiences and the silent stories of countless other nurses who had faced similar challenges. "Thank you for joining us, Nurse Parker," began Mr. Edwards, his tone gentle yet encouraging. "Your perspective has been invaluable, and we believe that your insights can guide St. Mary's toward a better, more inclusive environment for all staff." Angela nodded, her gaze steady. She knew this was an opportunity to speak for herself and others, like her, who had faced the quiet injustices woven into the hospital's fabric. One of the board members, a tall woman with sharp, inquisitive eyes, leaned forward. "Nurse Parker, we've heard from Mr. Edwards about your experience here, but we'd like to hear directly from you. Can you share what specific changes you believe could improve the work environment at St. Mary's?" Angela took a deep breath, feeling the surge of purpose and conviction. "Thank you for the opportunity," she began. "First and foremost, I believe that fostering an environment of respect should be our top priority. Acknowledging the skills, contributions, and humanity of every staff member, regardless of background, can create a sense of true teamwork and unity." She continued, her words flowing with ease as she outlined specific concerns. The dismissive attitudes of senior staff, the unequal distribution of difficult assignments, and the lack of support for nurses and aides facing hostility from patients and colleagues. Angela described her own journey. Her excitement when she joined, the exclusion she felt, and the way she had been silently tested, her abilities called into question by those who refused to look past their prejudices. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Angela could see the contemplative expressions on the faces of the board members, a few nodding thoughtfully. Mr. Edwards finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Thank you, Angela. Your experiences highlight exactly what needs to change if St. Mary's is to truly live up to its reputation. I believe it's time we address these issues head-on, starting with a comprehensive review of workplace policies." Another board member, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a solemn expression, cleared his throat. "I agree. This is long overdue. Mr. Edwards, perhaps we could begin with a committee to implement a code of conduct that emphasizes mutual respect and accountability. Our staff should be aware that their behavior affects not only morale, but the quality of patient care as well." Angela's heart swelled with gratitude and hope as she listened. This was the first time anyone in authority had openly acknowledged the need for change at St. Mary's. Mr. Edwards gave her a nod of encouragement, and she knew that her voice had finally been heard. The following week, St. Mary's announced the creation of a new committee, tasked with promoting an inclusive and supportive work environment. The committee would work closely with board members and senior staff, reviewing everything from assignment protocols to reporting processes for workplace grievances. It was a major step, and Angela felt a surge of pride, knowing that her experiences had directly contributed to this initiative. The response among the staff was mixed. Some welcomed the changes, understanding that a more supportive environment would benefit everyone. But others, particularly those who had been content to maintain the status quo, expressed resentment. Angela overheard whispers from a few nurses and doctors who were unhappy with what they saw as unnecessary meddling. "Now they want us to walk on eggshells," one nurse muttered bitterly in the break room. "All because someone can't handle a little tough love." Angela felt the sting of their words but held her head high, determined not to let their resistance discourage her. She knew that change was never easy, especially when it challenged deeply rooted beliefs and biases. But she also knew that with Mr. Edwards' support, there was momentum building toward a better future for Street Marys, and she was ready to be part of that transformation. One afternoon, as Angela finished her rounds, she noticed Dr. Greaves lingering near the nurse's station. His expression was unreadable, his usually sharp eyes softened by something she couldn't quite identify. Uncertainty, perhaps, or even a flicker of guilt. He approached her, hesitating before he spoke. "Nurse Parker," he began, his tone unusually subdued. "I wanted to speak with you about the changes. It seems you and Mr. Edwards have managed to stir things up around here." Angela waited, unsure of his intentions. "I believe these changes will make Street Marys a better place for everyone," she replied calmly. Dr. Greaves nodded, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "Yes, I imagine they will. I know I haven't made things easy for you," he admitted, his voice low. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge. I thought I was maintaining standards, but maybe I was just holding on to old ways that no longer serve us." Angela was taken aback by his honesty, her heart softening slightly. "Thank you, Dr. Greaves," she said, her tone sincere. "Change can be difficult, but I think we're all capable of growth." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips before he turned and walked away. For the first time, Angela saw a glimpse of the man beneath the authority, someone who was capable of recognizing his own flaws. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Angela noticed more shifts in the hospital's atmosphere. The nurses' station, once a place of hushed conversations and judgmental glances, began to feel warmer, more collaborative. Nurses who had once kept their distance now engaged her in conversation, asking her opinion on patient care and including her in discussions. Doctors who had previously ignored her started to greet her with nods of respect. The unspoken barriers that had isolated her were slowly coming down. Even patients noticed the difference. One elderly woman, Mrs. Alvarez, who had been in and out of Street Marys for years, remarked to Angela, "You know, dear, there's something different about this place now. People are kinder. It's like the walls have softened." Angela smiled, touched by the observation. She knew that real change took time, but the small shifts in attitude and behavior were tangible signs of progress. She felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, her sense of isolation replaced by a growing sense of belonging. Her connection with Mr. Edwards also deepened. Though he was nearing the end of his stay at Street Marys, he made a point of checking in with her regularly, often sharing insights from his years in leadership. They spoke about resilience, the value of integrity, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. "Nurse Parker," he said one day, his eyes filled with quiet pride, "you've not only earned the respect of your colleagues, but inspired real, lasting change. You should be proud of yourself." Angela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I never thought I could make this kind of impact. I only wanted to help people." "And you have," he replied, his voice warm. "But sometimes, helping people means challenging the very systems we work within. You've done both." As his discharge day approached, Mr. Edwards requested a final meeting with the board, during which he formally endorsed the committee's initiatives and pledged further funding to support staff training and development programs aimed at fostering a culture of inclusivity. His words carried weight, and his endorsement all but ensured that the changes would take root. The day Mr. Edwards left St. Mary's was bittersweet for Angela. She had come to see him not only as a mentor but as a friend, a person who had seen her potential when others couldn't. As he said goodbye, he gave her a parting gift, a small silver pin shaped like a laurel wreath. "It belonged to my mother," he explained softly. "She wore it every day to remind herself of her strength and resilience. I think it's only fitting that it goes to you." Angela accepted the pin, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I promise to carry this legacy forward." As she watched him leave, Angela felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She knew that her journey was far from over, but with each small victory, each moment of compassion, she was helping to shape a brighter, more inclusive future for St. Mary's. The hospital would never be perfect, but with allies like Mr. Edwards and the strength of her convictions, she was ready to keep pushing forward, one day at a time. Angela had arrived at St. Mary's hoping to make a difference, and now, with the winds of transformation finally blowing, she knew that she already had. The legacy of change. The weeks following Mr. Edwards' departure were both challenging and transformative. Although he had left the halls of St. Mary's, the changes he had championed were just beginning to take root. With his parting words and the quiet strength Angela now carried, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a purpose that went beyond simply enduring, but truly thriving and shaping the future for others like her. The newly established Committee on Inclusivity began its work in earnest. Representatives from different departments gathered weekly to discuss workplace culture, staff grievances, and new policies that would promote mutual respect and accountability. The committee's efforts introduced a series of respect and collaboration workshops, designed not only for new staff, but also as a required training for all existing employees. This move met with a mix of enthusiasm and resistance. While some welcomed the training, others were quick to complain about unnecessary hand-holding. Angela, however, found herself stepping into a new role, one that made her more visible within the hospital than she had ever been. As one of the few nurses who had openly shared her experiences, she was asked to serve as an advisor to the committee, offering insights that would help inform the new policies. It was a role she had never expected, but one she took on with determination. Her presence was a symbol of the changes happening within St. Mary's, and though it placed her under even closer scrutiny, she felt a deep sense of responsibility to those who had faced similar struggles in silence. One day, as Angela walked through the corridors, she was approached by Nurse Trish, one of the nurses who had been particularly cold toward her in the past. Trish shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering with uncertainty before she finally spoke. "Angela, could I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice unusually subdued. Angela nodded, bracing herself. "Of course, Trish." They found a quiet spot near the break room, and Trish looked down, avoiding Angela's gaze. "I just wanted to say, I didn't make things easy for you when you started here. I know that, and I guess I owe you an apology." Angela raised her eyebrows, surprised by the admission. "Thank you for saying that, Trish." Trish looked up, meeting Angela's eyes with a hint of vulnerability. "It's just, I've been here for years, and we've always done things a certain way. Change is hard, you know. And when you came in, well, I guess I felt threatened. But seeing how you've handled everything, it's made me realize that maybe we do need to rethink some things." Angela's heart softened as she recognized the difficulty in Trish's words. She knew the journey toward acceptance and understanding wasn't easy, and change often required uncomfortable reflection. "I understand, Trish," Angela replied, her voice gentle. "Change is hard for everyone. I didn't come here to disrupt things. I just wanted to be part of the team, like anyone else." Trish nodded, a small smile breaking through her usual stoic demeanor. "Well, you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, and if you ever need a hand with those committee things, let me know. I'd like to help." Angela felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was more than she'd ever expected. "Thank you, Trish. I'd appreciate that." As Trish walked away, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. Slowly but surely, the walls around her were coming down, and she knew that every connection, every shift in perspective, was a step toward creating a better environment, not just for herself, but for all the nurses and staff who would come after her. The months passed, and Street Mary saw noticeable changes. The respect and collaboration workshops were in full swing, and the effects were beginning to show. Staff meetings became more collaborative, and team members were encouraged to voice their ideas openly. Assignments were more evenly distributed, ensuring that no single nurse was given all the challenging cases simply as a test of resilience. New staff, regardless of background, were given a fair chance to integrate into the team. Angela's new advisory role also meant she was frequently called into discussions with the board to offer insights on potential improvements in patient care and staff relations. She had grown into the position, her confidence in her abilities, and her voice stronger than ever. The girl who had once stood in front of a room full of skeptics, forced to prove her worth, was now recognized as a leader. She wore the laurel wreath pin Mr. Edwards had given her every day, a quiet tribute to the woman who had raised her and the legacy of resilience she carried forward. Then, one afternoon, she received a call that left her both stunned and deeply honored. Street Mary's board had voted unanimously to award her the hospital's Service and Dedication Recognition, an honor traditionally reserved for long-serving staff members. The news spread quickly through the hospital, and Angela found herself flooded with congratulations from both colleagues and patients. She felt a swell of pride, not only in the award, but in the fact that it represented more than her personal achievements. It was a testament to the importance of standing firm, of advocating for one's rights, and of pushing for a better, fairer workplace. The ceremony was scheduled to take place in the hospital's courtyard, where friends, family, and colleagues would gather to celebrate her contributions. Angela's mother attended, her pride radiating as she held Angela's hand, whispering words of encouragement just as she had when Angela was a child. Standing there, surrounded by people who had once doubted her but now recognized her worth, Angela felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. During her speech, Angela addressed her colleagues, her voice strong and steady. "I want to thank everyone who has supported me," she began, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "My journey here hasn't always been easy, but I stand here today as proof that change is possible. We can make Street Mary's a place where everyone, regardless of who they are, feels valued and respected. I hope this is just the beginning of a culture where we uplift each other and work together as a true team." Her words were met with applause, and she saw tears in her mother's eyes, a powerful reminder of the legacy of resilience she had carried forward. She felt the weight of generations behind her, the strength of her mother's sacrifices, and the quiet wisdom of Mr. Edwards' mentorship. They had all played a role in this moment in her journey. After the ceremony, Angela found herself approached by Dr. Greaves, who offered her a handshake, his expression uncharacteristically humble. "Nurse Parker, congratulations," he said, his voice softened by an unfamiliar sincerity. "I know I've been tough on you. But I respect what you've accomplished here. Street Mary's is better because of it." Angela accepted his hand, offering a nod of understanding. "Thank you, Dr. Greaves. I know change isn't easy, but I'm glad we're moving in the right direction." For a moment, Dr. Greaves lingered, as if wanting to say more, but instead, he simply nodded and stepped back. Angela sensed that he, too, had been changed by the experience, his once rigid views softened by her strength and resilience. As the celebration wound down, Angela took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. The girl who had walked into Street Mary's with nervous determination was now a leader, her voice no longer silenced by doubt or prejudice. She had found her place, not just within the hospital but within herself. Her journey at Street Mary's had transformed her, shaping her into a nurse, a mentor, and a symbol of strength for those who would come after her. Months later, Angela walked through the halls of Street Mary's, her reputation as a compassionate, resilient nurse firmly established. New nurses joined the team with an understanding that they would be supported, and the hospital's culture had shifted toward one of inclusivity and respect. The environment was far from perfect, but it was leagues away from the cold, unwelcoming place Angela had first encountered. One afternoon, as she completed her rounds, Angela received an unexpected visitor. It was Mr. Edwards, looking healthier and radiating his familiar quiet authority. He had come to visit, curious to see the changes that had taken root since his stay. They sat together in the hospital garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You've done remarkable work here, Angela," Mr. Edwards said, his voice filled with pride. "I knew from the moment we met that you had the strength to create something lasting." Angela smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "I couldn't have done it without you. Your support gave me the courage to keep going, even when it seemed impossible." Mr. Edwards nodded, reaching out to place a hand on hers. "Remember, Angela, the changes you've made here aren't just for you. They're for everyone who dreams of a better future, who believes in a fairer world. Keep going. This is only the beginning." As they parted ways, Angela watched Mr. Edwards walk through the hospital doors one last time, knowing she had gained not only a mentor but a friend who had believed in her when she needed it most. And as she stood there, she felt an unbreakable bond to Street Mary's, a place she had once thought might break her, but had instead given her the platform to reshape its very foundation. Angela turned back toward the hospital, ready for whatever lay ahead. She had become more than a nurse at Street Mary's. She had become part of its heart, a force that would inspire others long after her shift ended. And as she walked through those halls, head held high, she knew that her legacy of resilience, justice, and compassion would endure in the walls of Street Mary's for generations to come.